Hey guys, so I'm going to do a video that might be a little touchy, just a fair warning, but I figure I don't even need trigger warnings before my video because what I'm trying to do is constantly expose the hidden things that are influencing us, and we're only ever triggered if there's a looming belief system or misconception which is informing our behavior that we're in denial of. So the topic of the video is going to be this whole gender debate or gender topic that's really proliferating and spreading in importance, I feel, in the cultural landscape right now. And I've spent the last few nights actually watching videos of debates and stuff about this, about gender pronouns and laws surrounding gender pronouns and all those Jordan Peterson videos. Not even going to touch on all of that. I can see some bullshit in everything, you know. And there's just been some impressions I've had around this for a while. And also that I've had to have impressions about because I went to a very, very liberal university, Evergreen State College in Washington. And the political climate at that university was that in every class, at the beginning of class, you would have to give your pronouns as well as your name. And I would always just basically say, I don't really care what you call me. And I'm not saying that to deny whatever everybody else is feeling, you know, not doing that white move or whatever they want to say. I'm just, because I really don't have a side. I just really want to dive into this problem. And I think I should start by saying that I really don't feel that the problem is whether there's just two genders, which, I don't know, obviously there's a lot of different types of people, of human beings with different biology. And I also don't want to say that for that reason there can be an endless variety of labels which all have to be given equal credence with no fucking backing whatsoever other than theoretical concepts. So I can see both sides of this. And I just watched a video last night of a guy sitting out with a table that said, "Change my mind, there's only two genders," and then him talking to trans people and stuff like this. And at first I could see his side of the argument, but then this trans woman sat down and she seemed much more open-minded and not defensive than he did. And part of the reason is he kept saying, I'm not concerned about your truth, I'm concerned about the scientific biological truth, which is that there's only two genders. And she would say, well, the truth of our biology is completely individual, so to make that claim is to make a lot of assumptions. And I agreed with her. I said, that's a much better argument than the argument this guy's making. First of all the sciences we have regarding the human body are completely imperfect. That's why we don't produce cures. We're still doing all this research all the time on unsolved dilemmas, and we don't understand who we are. So until we understand who we are, it seems like an open area of inquiry. So to just say, because the past research tends in this or that direction regarding gender, is not enough. It's not enough. Scientists are also ignorant of their true nature very often. They're often possessed by belief systems and dogmatic structures of conceptualization, just like everybody else. And that's just a historical truth of the time we're living in, is that if we don't do some very profound, deep inner work and understand who we are in a definite way, which is possible, then we are bound to be possessed by dogmatic conceptualizations, which really do function like a possession. as I explain in my novella, The Indwelling. And I'll post the Amazon link to that novella below if you're interested in learning about possession and things like that. So I want to say I think the real confusion at the bottom of this whole thing is still the confusion between the mind and the body, what their relationship is, if there's a duality there, and what is really the authentic human being, as Philip K. Dick put it, and what is really real as far as identity goes and what isn't really us. And if we don't understand this basic question, then every concept we're going to form around the question of identity, politics, quote unquote, is going to be short-sighted. So I guess I'll start with the fundamental proclamation, right, that gender is different from sex. First of all, these are both linguistic constructs for a very complicated human organism. So my interest is not to pin it down in any way. My interest is just to elucidate what I understand of this problem and how it could be more readily comprehended for those who deal with it all the time. And I don't necessarily have a problem with the idea that the energies we're working with as human beings are more performative. So I could be performatively enacting a feminine energy, quote unquote, even if I have male biology. And if that's the distinction you're making between gender and sex, I have no problem with it. The problem is when you make the distinction between gender and sex and then make gender into gender identity, then it stops being performative like you say it is. Because something that's performative is something that you have to enact. And identity is not something that enacts. It's the idea that there's somebody acting. And this is the fundamental misconception that we need to dive into the bottom to, straight through. And as soon as you form an identity about the way you're performing and about the way you're functioning, then you're going to start demanding all sorts of things to protect what is basically a misconceptualization of who you are. And no, I do not mean by saying that when someone says they are non-binary, because I feel all human beings are non-binary, right? We all have many different facets and many different dimensions. But if someone says they're non-binary, but then creates a new pronoun and says, this is my identity, this is fundamentally delusional. It's just as delusional for a man to say, I identify as a male, as it is for someone who doesn't fit into these easily established categories to say, I am whatever Z's or whatever pronoun you want to use. I don't know all of them. There's so many. And the problem is when you create an identity that's based on this loose mental conception of yourself, then the things you could demand to protect that identity are endless. And this is where I see people standing up in regards to that whole Peterson dilemma or whatever. But there's also a flaw with the Peterson parrots, you could say. And the flaw is that their response is to say, well, it's not fair for you to enforce these words without proper evidence, but we're just going to use the evidence that's already been accumulated as enough evidence to deny what you're saying. And that's not right either. They're not really keeping an open mind and saying, well, this needs to be investigated more. We don't really understand these things entirely. Instead, they're saying, well, we only have the authority of this past accumulated scientific data. And that's a fundamental flaw and failure in their logic, in my opinion. Also, the logic that these Peterson parrots are constantly quoting evolutionary psychology in evolutionary biology and saying, well, this is the way it's historically been. Well, yes and no, but the whole other point of evolution is that we're not controlled by the previous stages. There's also potentials that are unactualized in the human being, and deviations and mutations and all this that cause us to keep moving forward and keep expanding. So they have a completely inaccurate characterization, a caricature of what it means to think in terms of evolutionary psychology, because you also need to understand that we're still evolving. So you can't just cite what we've done already and say that's evidence, that's a sufficient reason to disregard the new claim. You know, like I said, I'm not having a side. I'm sure I might still trigger some people with some things I'm saying. I'm sorry, but that's just how it's going to go for me to speak what I know and what I can offer to this conversation. So I see a delusion. Delusions proliferate. Delusions are definitely embedded in both sides of this argument, because it's like I said, the fundamental secret dilemma, which is really being discussed here, which people are having all this confusion about, which is really the confusion our species is having right now, is whether we're our mind or whether we're our body. Because if we have an identity of any sort, we've identified with our mental process. And this is a complete schizophrenia or dissociation from the body. And to go around demanding that people only relate to you as a quote-unquote person, an identity, and not as a human organism is the fundamental delusion which is causing our planet to go haywire right now. And that these people in this really liberal mentality are not the only people that are doing this. So I'm not making that claim. I'm just saying they're an example. And they're just a further example of what we all do when we say, oh, please respect this person I am. Please respect my vulnerability and all this. Is, yeah, on one level that's true, but you're not that person. That person is just a construct or a temporary dissociation that the whole body is using in an attempt to understand itself, as I explained in my last video. So, as soon as you demand that people only treat you this way and draft up legislation to require people, you're requiring that people assume that we are the body, that we are the mind and not the body. And this is very similar to the idea of it being heresy to question the existence of a soul in ancient sort of crusade-esque times with Catholicism and stuff. You're asking people to fundamentally assume that the open question of whether we are the body or the mind, or whether the two are just one organism, which is what I would say, but it is a little bit more complicated than that, because the mind is not contained to the body, but what we call our mind, the ego, is contained in a sense in the body and is a dissociation of the body from itself. So just as if you were to say it's heretic to say that there's no soul and that you would be burned for that, to say that I identify this way and you are uncompassionate if you don't acknowledge that identification is to require people by forceful means to assume that not only you are your mind, but that they are the mind and not the body. And this is disastrous. It's disastrous. And I do not buy into at all that it really ever harms a person's mental health to offend them. If they are offended, it's because they have areas where they are confused. Like, language can't really hurt who we really are. It may cause misunderstandings, and this may cause pain, but this misunderstanding can help us to understand and grow. And usually I don't do videos at all with any sort of that touch on much overtly partisan or political topics, and that's why I'm not approaching this in a partisan or particular way if you pay attention to what I'm saying. I'm just breaking down the fundamental problem that is at the root of what is essentially a philosophical question of what we are. So I am no way saying that there are only these categories and this is superfluous. It's very specific what I'm saying. I'm saying that to identify yourself with any category is to split yourself off from the organism which you are. And that goes for anybody. It goes for someone who thinks that they are a businessman as much as it goes for someone who thinks that they are a woman when they are biologically male. It doesn't mean that they aren't some anomaly in the genetic chain and that they don't deserve respect for being different. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It means that the thought, the identity that comes up is always misplaced, no matter who's thinking it. If you identify with your thought, it's misplaced. Because my claim, as always, is that we are these bodies coming to awareness of ourselves through a mirroring process, like I explained in my last video, which involves a species mind. And it's a very complicated argument based on a lot of experience I've had. So it's fundamentally misplaced in my book to make something which is performative, which may be the case, as I said, into something which is substantial. In the same way, it's fundamentally misplaced to make statistical data, which is always impartial. I worked in statistics for 3 years. I can tell you, you don't reach every demographic. Very few people are going to participate in every study, and there's specific age groups that are more likely to even want to participate because they're lonely and home than others, and so on and so forth. So statistics is such an imperfect science, it's almost just bullshit. Because we're all, like the trans woman said in the debate I watched last night, we're all individual biological iterations of the human blueprint, completely unique. So you cannot take a statistical measurement of something and then apply it to everybody, and that's just as much a mistake. So to say, well, based statistically, that there's this or that implication regarding the actual amount of gender occurs, that's also a complete logical mistake. Both sides are caught up in their bullshit and their thinking identities. One side identifies as rational, materialist people, and one side identifies as sensitive, compassionate, non-gendered people. Both sides are identifying as people, and thus they don't understand the fact that they are biological organisms which are beyond strict definition. And I really don't have a gripe with Peterson. I've seen a lot of people posting Peterson quotes for a while now, and I had a friend out in Washington who really excitedly came in one day and said, "Hey, watch this talk, listen to this guy talk," and I wasn't that impressed. And the reason is, and I mean, if by some magical coincidence Peterson never saw this video, I would love to talk to you, dude. I'm sure we'd have a productive conversation. But his mistake is he really depends on cultural ideas of order and argues that these are inbuilt evolutionary mechanisms which keep our society functioning. That's a very tricky slope because, like I said before, if you're going to talk about evolution at all, you need to understand that the mechanism in evolution that leads to change is not repetitive behavior and stable patterns, but new variables which break up those patterns. So it's just a picking and choosing, a cherry picking of the full spectrum of what evolutionary psychology implies. So I'm just trying to clear away all the mind formation surrounding this. The answers are not so obvious. The only answer we can give is that we all possess an individual biological makeup and that we shouldn't be imposing any definition or routine or framework on each other anymore. Like, we're getting to the point in the historical process where we just need to drop these frameworks and have some fucking humility, you know, about what we know and what we don't, in the limits of the intellectual machine. The intellectual machine cannot decipher these questions because it's only an instrument of what we are. So you cannot decipher what you are with the intellectual machine. You cannot understand who you are with the mind. You can't. And this is the fundamental thing that needs to be understood if anything productive is going to be come to in this whole discussion. Because you can't pretend to understand who you really are and then identify with your mind and your thoughts and your feelings and not your body. And if you go down that road, it's going to be disastrous and confusing for you as much as everybody around you. But you also can't pretend to have understood this problem based on the scientific paradigm and accumulated instrument-based, study-based data that's come into our species library only very recently, over the last couple hundred years. You can't. So, I just wanted to make this admittedly quick video where instead of really sharing any of my knowledge in this video, I more want to outline the limitations of our knowledge surrounding this, because I can tell that it's going to be a heated, energetic cluster forming surrounding this whole problem. And I'm saying what I'm introducing to the conversation here is, like, what is it really that's being discussed here? Are we really this upset about this or that identity, or are we fundamentally confused and in anguish about the confusion of whether we are our mind or our body, and that there's a split there between the mind and the body? So, just a few basic concepts without concepts. Conceptualists vantage points to tack on around this discussion. Don't parrot. Consider this. It's a deep topic. Consider it deeply, because the topic is really yourself and whether you understand yourself. you can't expect others to be satisfied with your confusion about yourself, but you also can't pretend that you have a better perspective of someone's confusion than they do when you yourself are still attached to dogmatic presumptions and just calling that scientific data or hard facts. There are no hard facts regarding the human body. The human body is like an octopus. It changes, it morphs. It's not static. It's not a sculpture which stays the same. It's clay which is morphing based on the requirements of the environment. And I think it's very possible that we are really being asked right now to really look at all the different types of people which have been cast aside by the majority of our belief systems. And really all belief systems are, like I said in every video ever, malperceptions of reality. I really feel that it's possible that a lot of these people who are coming out and saying, oh, I really need to be accepted, they probably do, and we probably need to, because that could be a new variation in the evolutionary progression. That being said, I also feel that it is fundamentally an act of non-acceptance and stubborn sort of big-headedness and narcissism to respect or expect others to partake in the confusion you feel about this. And I just feel like it is a fact that that's why I've seen a lot of people like this doing. Like I said, I was in that climate. At the school I went to, there was a 50-something% LGBTQ population of people who enrolled. So I was really immersed in that. And I myself don't identify anyway. I'm just a human organism. Zebra, which is beyond all opposites. So I hope you can hear me out centeredly, and just if there's any triggers when I'm talking, I hope you can always look at that trigger and say, why am I triggered? Because that's what I'm giving the invitation to do. I'm giving people the invitation to look at why they're triggered and then to become free from that. So much love. Peace, guys. I'll be on again soon.